Hello, I'm Tyshawn Jones, and this is Legacy Liner. Welcome aboard. It's Saturday. I usually try to post videos on Friday, but I had some microphone issues. But nonetheless, we're going to dig into the story of some of Titanic's passengers. What if I told you that that elderly couple that you see in the movie Titanic in their bed as the ship is sinking is actually based off of a real couple? And what if I told you that they owned a major retail store that you have most likely shopped at? Today, we are going to dig into the story of Ida and Isidor Straus. Let's get into it. So, Ida and Isidor Straus were both born on February the 6th. The only difference was Isidor was born in 1845 and Ida was born in 1849, which would have meant that they were 67 and 63 at the time that they traveled on board the Titanic. They were both born in Germany and eventually immigrated to America. Now, Isidor at first immigrated to Georgia, and there his father opened up a shop selling dry goods. After a few years, they ended up packing up and moving to New York, where he opened up a store called L. Straus & Son. And at this store, they sold crockery, porcelain, china, and the business did pretty well. In 1871, Ida and Isidor were married, and they had 7 children, one of which died in infancy. It was said that they were a couple that were always together, and if they had to be apart because of business that Isidor was doing, they would write each other every day. In 1874, Isidor's brother Nathan actually convinced a certain retailer to let them sell some crockery in the basement of one of his stores. Over time, Nathan and Isidor worked hard and ended up buying and owning this company. The name of it? Macy's. That's right. Isidor and Ida Straus were the part owners of Macy's department store. In January of 1912, Ida and Isidor, along with their 15-year-old granddaughter, decided to go to the south of France for a bit. And their granddaughter ended up going to Germany, and they decided that they wanted to head back to America. Now, they normally preferred to travel on German liners. In fact, they traveled on the America when they originally went over to Europe. But due to the cold strike, for the trip back to America, they decided to travel on this new liner everyone was talking about, the Titanic. They boarded the Titanic in Southampton, and they ended up staying in cabin C-55. This was the same suite that inspired James Cameron whenever he made the cabins for Rose and Cal. So when you look at the room that Rose was drawn in by Jack and the bedroom that her and Cal had in the movie, that was all based off of the Straus suite. Traveling with them was John Farthing. He was born in 1863 in England, and he was the son of a carpenter. So he would have been about 48 at the time of the sinking. He worked for a number of wealthy families, and at the time that he boarded the Titanic, he had been working for the Straus family for roughly 10 years. He had married in 1908, so he only had been married for about 4 years once he boarded the ship. He traveled in one of the servants' staterooms, cabin C-95. Not too far from him was Ellen Byrd, Ida Straus's maid. She would have been about 31 at the time that they boarded the Titanic. Ellen Byrd was born in 1881, and she was the daughter of a farmer and a shepherd. She was the middle child of 11 kids, and by the time she had moved out, she was living and working away from home as a servant. She was hired last minute because the maid that Ida originally had quit at the last minute. So she hadn't even hardly worked for the family, not even a month, at the time that they boarded the ship. She was not too far away in cabin C-97. So on the night of April the 14th, not too long after the collision, Ida and Isidor Straus were seen peeking out of their cabin in their bathrobes. Now, it's not known if it was the collision itself that woke them up or if it was the sound of the engine stopping that woke them up. Nonetheless, they were aware that something was off. Like so many other passengers, they were assured by the stewards that everything was okay and that they should go back to bed like everything was all right. Ida, however, just wasn't really too comfortable with this situation. So she rang for John and Ellen to come help her and Isidor dress. Now, after a while, the stewards started rousing the passengers and telling them to grab their life jackets and get up on deck. So Ida and Isidor, along with John and Ellen, were all fully dressed at this point, and they went up on the boat deck to follow the protocol. And once they realized that it was women and children first, Ida was not very pleased with having to leave her husband. Now, one of the stories that was circulating around the ship was that everything was all right, but the women and children needed to be put into a lifeboat and they would be back on board by breakfast. They were basically telling the women that it was a safety protocol. You're only leaving your husband for a couple of hours. Don't worry about it. And a lot of women genuinely believed this. Ida, however, was not falling for it. She knew that that story just didn't make sense. So her husband Isidor, Colonel Archibald Gracie, I think I also read that one of the officers and John Farthing were all trying to convince Ida to get into a lifeboat. They were like, get into a boat. It's women and children first. Please get into a boat. And she just was like, no, I'm not getting into a boat unless my husband can get in the boat with me. Now, being that Isidor was an elderly man, he was offered a space in the boat as well. They said, well, okay, I'm sure nobody would object to Isidor getting in the boat with you. But he said that he was not going to leave as long as there were still women and children on the boat as well. He was going to stay behind with the other men, and he wasn't going to get on the boat until all the men could get in. Now, after a bit of peer pressure from her husband, John Farthing, and a few crew members and other passengers, Ida gave in and got into lifeboat number 8, but she was not in there for long. The moment that she looked back and saw her husband stepping back with the other men, she turned around and got out. And it was said that whenever Isidor was trying to protest again, she said, we've been together for many years. Where you go, I go. And she refused to leave his side. She then turned to Ellen Byrd, her maid, took off her fur coat and gave it to her and said, here you go, I won't be needing this. Her and Isidor then locked arms and walked away from the lifeboats. Now, I've heard two different versions of what happened. I heard that they were last seen sitting in deck chairs holding hands, and I've heard that they were last seen standing at the railing arm in arm. Now, honestly, both of those could be true. It could just be a matter of who saw them last. But the general story is they spent their last few moments alive in each other's embrace. The movie depicted them in their cabin with the water rushing in, but it does seem that they were last spotted on the upper decks of the ship. John Farthing was also lost during the sinking. Now, Ellen Byrd, being the only surviving member of the Straus party, when she got to New York, she told the Straus's family what happened, and she actually tried to give the fur coat back to Ida Straus's eldest daughter, but she refused. She said, my mother gave it to you, so she would want you to have it. Ellen went on to work for the Speeden family, which was another family that was traveling first class on board the Titanic, and she married in 1914. Once she married, she moved to Boston, and they had a daughter who died at the age of 2. She worked for a number of prominent families in Newport, and eventually she passed away on September 11th, 1949. Isidor's body was found, and his family put him to rest in the Woodlawn Cemetery in New York. One of the things that was found on him was a locket containing a picture of his two eldest children, which to me, that is such a touching thing to think about, because you can just imagine as the ship was sinking, him and Ida, arm in arm, looking at this locket, thinking about their family that they created, thinking about the wealth that they created, thinking about this beautiful life that they had together and everything that they've done. Their story is probably one of those stories like the band playing to the end. If you've watched any Titanic documentaries, seen any Titanic movies, their story is mentioned multiple times. It's part of the legacy of the Titanic and what happened to her and the passengers that night. There was actually multiple memorials that have been made in their honor. And one of them that was presented, over 6,000 people attended. Their cabin inside of the ship has actually been explored several times over the last couple of decades. So the next time that you watch Titanic and you see that scene of the elderly couple in the bed as the water is rushing in and Nearer My God to Thee is playing in the background, I want you to take a minute to think about Ida and Isidor Straus. And think about how their story is the real story of love and sacrifice on that cold April night. And alright, that's my video on Ida and Isidor Straus and their maid Ellen Byrd and their valet John Farthing. Come back next week where we'll talk about the only black family that traveled on board the Titanic. Y'all have a good one.